of course, most Democrats are for universal background checks, but most NRA members are for universal background checks. Most Republicans are for universal background checks.
You're listening to Talking About Guns, or TAG as we like to call it. My name is Matt Littman. I'm Executive Director of 97%. We're a new bipartisan organization working to reduce gun deaths in America. As part of our mission to change the conversation around gun safety, TAG normalizes dialogue about guns. We invite guests from all sides of the gun debate and talk about the hot button issues, but without the screaming. My guest today is the first Gen Z member of Congress. At 26 years old, he's already worked on 3 presidential campaigns and for multiple nonprofits, including serving as National Organizing Director of March for Our Lives. He's a survivor of gun violence himself, and the first bill he introduced as a member of Congress was to create a gun violence prevention office. Congressman Maxwell Frost, welcome to TAG.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on.
So you're 26. You're the youngest member of Congress. I remember when everyone thought AOC was young, and she was like 29 years old. You've taken that to another level. So just so folks understand, because I don't think that everybody understands what it's like being a member of Congress. You're in the Orlando area. That's your home base, right?
Yeah, Orlando's my home base.
And then you live in DC. Just out of curiosity, how does that, do you have to like buy a place in DC? How does that work?
So the way I always tell people is that, I always say I live in Orlando, but sometimes I work in DC, and that sometimes is a good amount of the year. But I don't necessarily live in DC. I live in the district, but I do have a lease there. And so the way it works is, and people can actually, it's funny, members usually don't tweet about it. I'm thinking I'm going to make my own branded calendar so people can see where I'm at. But it's actually public, right? You can go online and type in 2023 congressional schedule. I think Steve Scalise has one out as the leader of the majority, and you can see the days that members of Congress are in session or in the district. And generally, it kind of evens out to about a third of the year, maybe a little less. I think it's about a third that we're in DC. It hasn't felt like a third; it's really felt like half and half of as of recent. But I think we just have more weeks on than off right now in DC. And so the way it works is, we'll go up on a Monday and votes will be called at 6:30 p.m. They call those votes on a fly-in day the bed check votes. They're usually non-controversial suspension votes that, they're not controversial, and it's really just to make sure you're in town for the votes the next, 2 or 3 days, and then you fly home. And then when you fly home, it's really up to the member the way that their schedule works. I have a pretty aggressive schedule at home, so I never say, oh, we're on recess or I'm off. You're not off when you go back to your district. And in fact, we're really just as busy here at home versus DC. And so you're kind of between the two places off and on. But it makes sense to have a lease or buy a place in DC because you're there so often. I don't have the money to buy a place yet.
Right.
So, I'm leasing.
But,
you
see, these members of Congress all living together. Some like 3 of them will be living in the same place together because they're there 3 days a week.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of members who stay together. So it really depends on like what you do. I have a lease that's around where I work, so I can walk to work, and I think that's what I'll keep it at. Just having a lease.
So before we even get into the gun issue, compared to your expectations, how have these first few months been?
So, because I've worked kind of government adjacent for a while, whether it was at the ACLU or in the gun organizations that I worked at, gun violence prevention or campaigns, I've been pretty familiar with kind of the pace. But the thing that's really not shocking, but surprising to me that I'm still getting used to is the pace itself. And what I mean by this is I'm used to working long hours, right? I've worked on campaigns where you're working 15, 16 hours a day nonstop, like no days off, very, not good. And so coming into Congress, I, was used to that. But my joke now is during the campaign, I'd work a 12, 14-hour day, come home and be exhausted and just be tired and want to go to sleep. Now I work a, 12, 16-hour day or whatever, as a member of Congress, and I come home and I'm tired, but my head also hurts. And part of that is because, in a campaign, you kind of have one goal, win, 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 and you're
Right.
kind of doing very similar things to win. And in Congress, as a member, I'm doing, a full day of 20-minute meetings.
I was going to
And
ask you that. Okay.
yeah, and each meeting is on a completely different subject
Right.
where I'm briefed on it 5 minutes before. Maybe I
Right.
read about it the night before. I'm going to like, a committee hearing or I'm doing a question line. And if I'm in House Oversight, there's yelling going on. And if I'm in science, it's more heads down. And so everything is so different, right? And then at 5 or 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. when votes are done, I go to a few reception events to, go to support organizations I agree with or that I want to support. And then I'm home by like 9 or 10. And then I wake up very early the next morning and do it all again. And so there's more brain power being used, I would say, now than ever in my life.
So
So
this
it's
is something that I don't think people really know about members of Congress. So how many meetings, you said 20-minute meetings and hearings, how many meetings plus hearings would you say you do a day?
It depends on the type of day. I happen to be on one of the most high profile committees, which is House Oversight. I'm on it with your favorite people, Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Jim Jordan, Paul Gosar, all the favorites. And so it's a committee that the Republicans tend to value quantity over quality. And so there was one week a couple weeks ago where we had, I think it was 7 hearings in 4 days.
Wow.
And so weeks like that, it's hard to have meetings. And, I love having the meetings with constituents and organizations. And those weeks I'll be in the hearing room and we literally have to move all the meetings to the hallway of the hearing room. And so I'll be there and I run out and I do the meeting. And then in the middle of the meeting, one of my staff members will come out who's monitoring it and be like, hey, you're about to speak. You got to go in, run back in, speak, come back out, finish the meeting. Hey, you got to go vote, run back in. So it depends on the type of day. On a day where we have like half hearings and half meetings, we'll do anywhere from, 6, 7 shorter meetings, including we'll also do interviews on top of that. And then we'll also be in the hearing room. And here's the thing about the hearing room is that it's different per committee, but usually there's an order of speaking. And in order to be included in that order, you have to be there. And so a lot of times, I'm like mid seniority on my oversight committee. I'm sitting there for, you can be sitting there for a couple hours and you can't really move. And if you do move, you have to be back very soon. So it's interesting. I joke that Congress really needs to modernize because we'll have multiple hearings scheduled at the same time. And even colleges have apps that allow
Right.
you to schedule
Right.
your classes so they don't overlap. So I don't understand why Congress can't schedule the hearings in a similar way.
This is why you're there. So I think, it's amazing to me because also, not only do you have to be in these meetings, interviews, hearings, you have to know about so many different subjects. And when people are talking to you, they want your attention.
Yeah.
And so you have to know something about 18 different subjects in a day, let's say.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I'm one of these people that, and it's funny, I had a colleague come up to me and said, I find you to be a bit introverted. And I was like, I've never been called introvert my entire life. I've in fact been called the opposite my whole life. And I was thinking about it, I was like, it is true. Sometimes in some of these meetings, depending on the subject, I'm more of a listening mode. And I think politicians could tend to listen a little bit more, especially if I'm not an expert on the subject. I'm the type of person that if I'm going to open my mouth in a setting like that, I want to make sure I'm really either contributing or asking a question to further my own understanding. And so some of these meetings, I get a briefing before and I'll sit in and listen to people, and I am in a listening mode because I'm learning.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about these meetings is it's often a two-way street, right? It's about an organization or a person, a constituent telling me about how they feel about an issue and how they feel like I should vote. But the other part is they're educating me on it. Our legislators aren't experts in every single issue
Right.
there is, but a lot of people like to pretend they are. And I like to be honest. I actually set the tone for the meeting right when they walk in. So, let's say I'm sitting down with folks talking about I was talking with some people who are business owners with radio frequencies and how that relates to emergency services. And I sat down and said, I don't know much about this. I'm really excited for this meeting, excited to learn from y'all and be able to develop my position on this type of legislation you're talking about." And that actually excited them. And they were like, "Well, we're excited to tell you about something we're passionate about." And so it's, it depends on the type of meeting.
It's incredible. I think, most people handle like their job, which is one specific thing, basically one or two things, and yours are dozens of things at the same time. I mean, it's really just incredible. In terms of just getting involved in the gun violence issue itself, Congressman, where did that come from? What happened that you got involved in this issue?
So for me, how I got involved in this issue is actually how I got involved in politics in the first place. It was a little over 10 years ago now. I went to an arts middle school and high school. I played jazz drums. Before every jazz band concert, my best friends and I would go to this restaurant across the street, load up on junk food. I remember we're there eating, and there's a silence that fell across the entire restaurant. We kind of looked at each other. We're like confused. What the hell's going on? We finally look up at the television screens, and we see somebody walked into an elementary school in Newtown, Connecticut, and murdered 20 children and 6 teachers. And I did not grow up in a community where gun violence was an everyday occurrence, or really even an occurrence at all, to be honest. And so I remember seeing those images of the kids walking out of the elementary school with their hands in the air. And I remember then going to the concert and like not being able to focus. I kept playing wrong, I kept missing hits, and I kept looking over my shoulder at the exit signs. I was very anxious that someone was going to walk into that theater and kill my friends and I. And so that anxiety is now something that's very normal, for especially people of my generation who now go through more school shooting drills than fire drills, which is a very terrible reality.
Yep.
And so I ended up going to Washington, D.C. for the memorial. And it was there that I met a guy named Matthew Soto. His sister, Vicky, was a teacher at Sandy Hook who hid the kids in the closet to save their lives, and she was killed. And just, I remember, I describe it like an emotional whiplash, because the days leading up to that moment and that vigil, I had been hanging out with Matthew, and like we were, lobbying and going helping at schools, and not just Matthew, but all the kids from Sandy Hook, and like we were having a good time and just being kids. And then the night of the vigil hit, and then really seeing Matthew like break down, talk about his sister and everything. It provided that emotional whiplash that kind of made me uncomfortable to a point where I dedicated my life to fighting for a world where I wouldn't have to see, where people don't have to feel that type of pain anymore. And it's oftentimes when you're made the most uncomfortable that you're put in a position where you can say yes to a call to action. And that emotional whiplash at such a young age, being in a city I'd never been to before, Washington, D.C., being by myself, every little thing about those moments led me to go home and say, I'm going to organize. And that's really what changed my life and what got me involved in the movement.
And then when you say organize, so now how old are you when this is happening? 18, 19?
I was 15. So 15. I came back and, I started organizing locally in my school, doing petition drives, stuff like that. I ended up going to speak at a ton of vigils across the state. I would email these.
How did you have the confidence to go speaking at vigils across the state? It takes a lot of self-confidence.
Yeah, I think it's twofold. Number one, I'm an artist, and I was at an art school where I'd perform in front of people all the time. And I think like the skills of being performing per se, not that speaking at individuals performing, but you are like in front of people, and I was always comfortable with that. Growing up, I also did competitive speaking. So, all these things combined, I think like made me comfortable in my own skin.
What's competitive speaking? I don't know. I'm a former speechwriter. What the heck is competitive speaking? It's not debating.
I think it's the way I just explained. No one says competitive speaking. I did speech competition.
Okay.
Yeah, not competitive speaking. That's funny though. Someone should start some competitive speaking. You just gotta talk. You just say words.
Right.
No, I did competitive speech I did speech competition in elementary school and high school. And so I was already used to kind of, being an orator. And so that kind of changed everything for me, was learning, wow, I can really focus my energy in on an issue that has touched me personally. And so I remember the first vigil I spoke at was in St. Pete Beach. Well, no, it was it was next to St. Pete Beach. I forget the name of it. Indian Rocks Beach, I think is the name. And I just messaged this like group online. I think it was like a mom's van action group. I said, hey, I'm Maxwell Frost. I'm 15 years old. I just went to the vigil in DC. I met the families and I'd love to come speak about the youth perspective. And then they were like, come. And so my mom drove me over. And that was the first vigil I spoke at. It was on a beach. It was a bunch of like way older people I'd never met. And I just kind of talked about my experience and drove home. And that's really where it started locally for me.
Wow. And then did you work with Mom's Demand or what did you do after that? How did you stay involved?
No, I didn't get involved with the group I kept working with was Junior Newtown Action Alliance, and I actually was running kind of like an Orlando chapter per se.
Is this
As,
Congressman the group that Poe Murray is involved in? Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
yeah. So Poe runs Newtown Action Alliance, and Junior Newtown Action Alliance is like
Got it.
it's like an affiliate of NAA, and so I was an honorary Newtown Action Alliance member from Orlando, and I ended up going to the vigil every year. And I've been to it every year except I think 2 years that I've missed for the past decade. And so I would organize kind of under that umbrella in Orlando. And then I got to a point where I was thinking, I really want to build youth political power in my school. And I kind of shifted and I started to really focus on like school organizing in my school. And I ran for SGA president and did that for 2 years and really wanted to work at getting people registered to vote. And, you know, it's wild how experiences build off of one another because the vigil really pushed me to also just like be more involved in politics. And I actually ended up taking my South Side band at the time, and we went to DC and performed in President Obama's inauguration.
Wow.
And so getting to mix the arts and the politics really started at around that age.
Wow. And so then you decide to run for Congress. That's also a pretty significant decision to make, right? Because it's not just that you're running, you're probably in a competitive primary, you have to raise the money. How
Yeah.
does that even, you say, I'm going to go do this. How do you even know what to do?
So the good thing is I had right out of high school, like at 18 years old, I graduated high school. I started doing college. I had been doing, nowadays you can start doing college in high school, but I went to college and I started. My job outside of college was I was working at a Nissan car dealership in online sales. I did that for 3 months. And then I got a call. I had been volunteering on the Bernie Sanders campaign locally here. And I got a call from someone who had been involved with the Bernie campaign but went on to work for Hillary. And he said, hey, we're hiring field organizers full time. We would need you to move to Fort Myers. We're going to figure out housing for you
Wow.
and you're going to get paid $2,000 a month. And I was like, $2,000 a month? I'm going to be rich. And so I was like, I need to go do this. So I, packed my bags and I think I had a Nissan Versa. Yeah, I had the Nissan Versa. And my parents were like, okay, go work for Hillary. And I drove to Fort Myers and lived with some lady in a double wide trailer and started organizing. And so I started working full time on campaigns at 18. And after that campaign, I was like, when this ends, I'm going back to college in person, going to finish up. And I had a whole plan. And then a few weeks after that campaign ended, I got a call. Hey, we have a special election. We want you to come be the field director for and run the field program. So I said, well, I got to do that. And then move my college online. And honestly, that's what kept going on until I ended up working at the ACLU, then March for Our Lives. I worked about 4 other campaigns and then ended up running for office. So because I had worked
Yeah.
so many campaigns and because at 23, I was the national organizing director at March for Our Lives, I actually had a good amount of connections
Right.
in the campaign world.
Right.
And I pieced together a kitchen cabinet of trusted people that I trusted from across the country, really, who helped me put things together. My campaign manager was actually somebody who I worked with on 2 previous campaigns. And he had been on my kitchen cabinet, and I was asking him for advice. And he was like, Maxwell, what do you think about me coming to run your campaign? And I was like, that makes a lot of sense. And so he moved within 3 days. And for the first 2 months, it was really just him and I grinding out every day in my house
Wow.
and making this work.
Wow.
His name is Kevin Lotta. He actually was just awarded the Best Campaign Manager of 2022 award.
Wow.
And because we really took it kind of reminds me of the evolution of a lot of artists with their managers who are independent artists.
Yep.
And they'll work hard with like some manager from their hometown and then just
Right.
explode. And it's kind of what happened with Kevin and I.
That's so exciting. And just out of curiosity, when you're not in DC or in Orlando and you're out and about and you meet somebody and you're talking to them and they say, "So what do you do?" And you say, "I'm a congressman." Do they believe you?
Um,
Is it
it's like half and half. I've had people. So yeah, when I'm home and in DC, people know who I am in
right?
those two places. So it depends. But if I'm like out, let's say I'm in New York or Los Angeles, and I'm just like going out to eat,
Right.
and so I'm talking with someone, they ask what I do, and I say, you know, I. There's thing I hate saying it because I feel like such an ass, like I'm a congressman. It's
Right.
just hard
Right.
to say
It
that.
almost sounds pretentious, but it is your
I,
job.
it sounds it's the same thing. I used to work on music festivals, and I used to work at Coachella. And so when I talk with people about where I was working, they'd be, "What music festival do you work for?" And I'd be like, "Ugh," and I'd be like, "I
Right.
work for Coachella." It
Right.
just sounds like,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
But either
Right.
way, so no, but I tell people, and I've had people literally like, what do you call it? I've had people like Google me in front of me.
Oh,
You know
that's
what I mean?
funny.
It's like, "Oh my God, you're
Right.
not lying," and I'm
Right.
like, "Yeah, no,
No,
I'm
I'm
not."
not.
I'm
Right.
serious.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
but no, in general, most people are,
Pretty good.
I
Yeah.
don't look like a typical congressman, but
Right.
I think that's really changing, and that's really exciting.
You're the first of what we now unfortunately refer to as this mass shooting generation. I was at an event to get elected to Congress. I was at an event a few weeks ago that your friend Poe was doing, and a woman spoke from Newtown, and she was fantastic. I don't remember her name. She was a student those years ago. She's older now. And as I was listening to her, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this person is definitely going to be in Congress at some point in her life.
Yeah.
Do you feel that responsibility now because you're the first one? Do people talk about that with you a lot, that you're the first? How does that work?
Yeah, it's something that I always try to. There's like I think there's a lot to hold, here, and I tend not to take myself too seriously in that. Like I always make sure people know I don't represent an entire generation, like
Yeah.
but I am the first in the institution, and I think that there's something about that that's really important and exciting. But I do feel a sense of responsibility to make sure that I do everything I can to help young people, and not just young people, but new people get into office is something I always talk about. Obviously Congress skews a lot older, and we really need young people in office to make sure that we have that perspective of what it means to be a young person right now, which is just inherently different than what it was even a decade ago or 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago. And so I think it's important to have that experience. But the thing I really want to advocate for is young people, but also just new people. I think about someone like my mother. My mother's in her late 60s. She just retired. Her last day in school is in about 2 weeks. She's been a teacher for 37 years. And I look at someone like my mom, and I'm like, I would love someone like that representing their community, whether it's in Congress, school board, like whatever. And so, because she understands what it means to retire right now, like in this time that we're in. And I think that experience is important. She knows what it is to take care of her mother, who my grandma who passed away last year. She knows what it is to go
Right.
through that plight of being a working person and going through that. And that experience is important. So the way I think about it is when we talk about representative bodies like Congress, city council, school boards, we should want the most experiences represented as possible, because when we sit at the table to solve the both known and unknown issues of the future, we should want people to talk about the different things they've been through. And it's really beneficial for our country to have those experiences represented. And so that's all to say. It's really, yes, about young people, but also just about new people. And a lot of times those new people might be a little older, but I think
Yeah.
knowing what it is to be an older person right now and
Yeah.
not have the money that you need to be okay, I
Yeah.
think that experience is important.
So I do feel, though, that you're the beginning of a lot of people who are going to be running for office who've been involved in this gun violence issue. I think you're the first of what's going to be a whole group of people doing that sort of thing of different ages. They could be young people or older people or whatever it might be. One of the things we do is we try to find the common ground on gun issues. It's difficult sometimes to find, but do you have any thoughts on what might be common ground between gun owners and non-gun owners?
I think I think that there is a lot of common ground. And like if we look at the even the polling, and I know people like to, I don't believe, but when many polls say the same thing for
Yeah,
many years, there is a lot of validity to that. And what we know is this: number one, there is very broad appeal for common sense gun reform.
right.
Of course, most Democrats are for universal background checks, but most NRA members are for universal background checks. Most Republicans are for universal background checks. So the word bipartisanship for the rest of the country means what we can agree on.
Right.
For Congress, it means what the specific special interest in the issue can accept. And of course, the NRA is they're not for everyday gun owners or for everyday gun manufacturers, right? It's not an advocacy group, it's a lobbying group. And I think the distinction is important because their entire purpose is to boost profits. And so it's important that we just have to continue to keep that in mind as we move forward. And so I think there is bipartisanship, but the problem is in Congress it gets muddied up. Between us, I've had Republican members that, well, not between us, we're on a, between everybody listening. But I've had members, I won't say names, but I've had members who have off the record told me like, I would like to do something on gun violence, but I'm like, kind of scared to like break from my party on this. And that's true. And what we always like to tell them, and something, my friend David Hogg always brings up
Yeah.
is he always says, after the shooting that happened at his high school in Marjory Stoneman Douglas, we passed really good gun reform here in Florida.
That's right.
Not best, but good stuff. And there were some pretty nasty stuff included in it. But
You've got a red flag law.
Yeah, we got a red flag law. We raised the age. We did some good stuff. And every Republican that voted yes on it, guess what? They got reelected.
Right.
And so, we always like this in Florida, in the state of Florida. And so we always like to tell people that a lot of times that power that these organizations have, that the organizations tend to have, it's actually like soft power, and it's more of a threat than anything else. And it's up to us as legislators to challenge that power.
So
And
we've been meeting with Republican offices and Democratic offices, congressmen. A couple of things happen in the Republican offices, which are that folks, they mostly agree, right? Like you said, background checks, for example, red flag laws. A lot of folks say, but they don't want to be the face of it. They don't want to be the face of the Republican Party agreeing on that issue. We hear about that a lot, number one. Number two, we hear from a lot of these offices, not about the NRA, but about the Gun Owners of America, which is not a large organization, but is super aggressive. And and members of Congress care about hearing from them. So I think, one of the things that I'm thinking about, I wonder if you're thinking about it too, is how do we get people to be that aggressive who believe in gun reform, right? Like, in other words, we know, for example, that some people feel strongly about assault weapons or, whatever it might be. But on the things that everybody agrees upon, background checks and red flag laws, are the people who believe in that being aggressive enough, the areas of agreement?
I think that this has been a proposition for a long time, and the polling has backed it for a long time. And I feel like if there, Republicans who, in good faith, really wanted to act on it, should have already acted upon it. And that's really what I, where I'm at with this. I mean, it's important to have grace, but at the end of the day, man, like if there's, these shootings that are happening in these schools and you see the polling and you understand that, yes, I can vote yes on background checks and still be reelected. Why do you not have the courage to step up and vote for these things? And so I think, we could always stand to be more aggressive in pushing people 100%, but is there anything more aggressive than waking up in the morning and just seeing like the carnage that's going on in this country? It's difficult. And I'm still trying to figure out how do we work with people who are teetering, but they haven't quite picked, right? Because a lot of times if you push someone too hard, they go back in their corner.
That's right.
But sometimes you have the ability to change their heart and mind. We see what just happened in Tennessee with the Tennessee 3, that after all that happened, the governor came out and called for a special session on red flag laws. Now it looks like it's being pushed, and so
Yep.
we'll see what happens. But guess what? In public record, that governor has said that, and now we have something to hold him accountable to, which is more than we can say for Florida, right? With our governor. So
Well, that congressman, you remember that quote from the congressman who came out after that and said, "There's nothing we could do. I'm going to homeschool my kids."
yeah,
Right? Which was
yeah.
unbelievable thing to say because there are things we could do. Talk about a national
At least they're saying it out loud, though. At
Yeah, I
least they're
mean,
saying
it's
it out loud.
a gun related violence prevention office. That's something that we don't have. Why is that important?
Yeah, so this is the first bill that I ever filed. Really exciting. It's the Office of Gun Violence Prevention Act of 2022, 2023. And what it does is simple. And for people who don't know, our country does not have one federal office that coordinates on gun violence across the country. It's really split up by many different agencies and departments. And so what this bill would do is simply create an office, fund the office, nonpartisan, to ensure that we're aggregating data and research, giving it to municipalities, working on educating people on gun violence, but also providing a preventative recommendation efforts to Congress and to municipalities across the country. And so that's important. It's important that with a daily issue like gun
Yep.
violence, we need daily work and daily solutions. And an office that works on that and coordinates on that, I think is important, and I think we deserve it.
Can you, at the end of all of our podcasts, we ask our guests to tag somebody who would be a good guest for the show. Now, somebody, of course, once tagged the vice president, which is not that easy for us to get as a guest,
Yeah.
Kamala Harris. But is there somebody that you would tag who you think would be good for us to speak with?
Yeah, I would say my brother Gregory Jackson, who is the executive director of Community Justice Action
Yep.
Fund. They're doing amazing work, and he could really talk about community violence intervention, which I think is a really important and possibly quite bipartisan effort to end gun violence. So putting him on the spot and tagging him to come on and talk about that amazing work.
It's a great one. I've heard him speak on community violence, and you're right, that would be great. Congressman Frost, you're doing amazing work. Congratulations, and thank you for joining us on Tag.
Thanks for having me on.
And now for Dr. Siegel with Siegel Scope.
Thanks, Matt, and welcome to another edition of Siegel Scope. Today, I want to talk about stand your ground laws. There's a lot of, I think, misperceptions about what these laws are, the need for the laws, why they exist, and what the impact of the laws are. So first of all, some background information that's critical to understand. There is something called the Castle Doctrine, which is a part of the common law, and it basically holds that if you are in your home or your own property, that you are entitled to defend yourself and that there's no duty to retreat if you feel threatened. So if someone storms into your house in the middle of the night and you fear that they're coming to rob you or kill you, you can basically just shoot the person without asking questions. You don't need to try to retreat. You don't need to try to hide from them. You don't need to ask a lot of questions, and you're legally protected in your home. But that's not the case outside of your home or your property. If you're just walking in a parking lot and somebody looks threatening to you, and you interpret that they're threatening you, you can't just pick up a gun and shoot them. You have, first of all, a duty to retreat, meaning you at least have to try to avoid the confrontation if that's possible. What a stand your ground law is a law that basically extends the Castle Doctrine to outside the home. So it basically says that no matter where you are, as long as you're in a place where you are legally allowed to be, you can shoot first. You can, there is no longer a duty to retreat. If you feel threatened with severe bodily harm, you can act first and shoot the person, and that is considered self-defense, and you can't be prosecuted for that. Now, how did these laws come about? It wasn't just a decision that some legislators made somewhere to say, hey, this is a problem. We have people who are getting prosecuted for what really is self-defense, and so we have a major problem. The way this law came about is that the NRA and some of its lobbyists put on an orchestrated campaign to try to pass these laws throughout state legislatures. And again, it wasn't because there was a problem they were trying to address. It was because they wanted to try to change the culture of society into one that was more favorable to open self-defense. Why? Because that'll sell more guns. If people view guns as a necessary part of self-defense and that it's fine to do that anywhere, it helps to sell guns. And in fact, the strategy worked. The number of guns that have been sold for self-defense has been rising astronomically, and it saved the gun industry, which was really faltering because hunting and recreational uses of guns was going down. So it was actually a brilliant maneuver. They worked through the American Legislative Exchange Council and basically had model legislation that they just lobbied from state to state to state. It wasn't that each of these states had a problem and wanted to address it. It was that they were lobbied by the NRA, the gun lobby, through the American Legislative Exchange Council. And so there was a proliferation of these laws. Most of this happened in the late 1990s. And we still see some remnants of that today, as an occasional state now and then will go ahead and pass a stand your ground law. So what are the implications of this? Well, I think we've seen the implications of this in the last couple of weeks. There have been a number of shootings in which a person was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. For example, someone thought they were going to their apartment. It turns out they just were on the wrong floor or something like that. They knocked on the door. There was a wrong apartment building, not building, but room. And the person came to the door, felt threatened, and basically just shot them dead. And there have been a number of situations like this where somebody basically goes to the wrong place. They are felt to be a threat, and somebody shoots them. The typical situation is very racially charged. It's usually somebody who's Black who's being the victim of this. Much more often, it's someone who's Black. And the reason for that is that there are obviously stereotypes that someone who looks Black creates a feeling of greater threat, and therefore the individual's perceived threat level is heightened, and they're more likely to then react in a violent way, as opposed to if it was a white person knocking on their door, or accidentally, putting the key in, thinking it was their apartment. It would be less likely to result in a fatality. So, what does the research tell us? Well, the research shows that indeed stand your ground laws do increase firearm homicide rates. The states in which we see the greatest increases are states in which there was a lot of publicity surrounding these laws. Not every state stand your ground law has been associated with an increase in homicides. In fact, our research found that on the whole, there really wasn't a demonstrable increase. However, if you look at the early laws, for example, the law passed in Florida, if you go back to the 1990s, those laws are associated with increases in firearm homicide. And I think the reason for that is that if the law is not publicized, then nobody knows about it, it's not really going to change people's behavior. But in a state like Florida, where there was tremendous publicity about this, everybody knew that this law existed. It is going to change people's behavior. And, we may have seen that in the death of Trayvon Martin, when George Zimmerman essentially, shot him when there was a possibility of retreat or avoiding a fatal shooting. Basically, was confronting somebody who he had no business over. And the evidence shows that these things are happening, much more likely to happen again to African Americans. Is there a need for these laws in the first place? And I would argue that there is not. And the reason for that is this. You are already protected if you kill someone in self-defense. Self-defense is a valid legal defense for what would otherwise be a homicide. If you are acting in a situation where there's a perception of severe bodily harm or death, and if there is no possible retreat and no other possible recourse of action to de-escalate the situation, then you are covered by a self-defense argument. The only thing you're not covered for is if you don't make some effort to retreat, if you shoot before it's clear that you really are a threat, are threatened, or if you shoot before you have exhausted other options that may be available, such as fleeing the situation. So it's not necessary because you're already covered under self-defense. And if you don't try to retreat, if you don't try to de-escalate the situation, if you don't make some attempt to avoid the need for shooting the person, then that's not valid self-defense. That's basically murder. And if this stand your ground law is left in place, it actually decreases the threshold that people will use. And that's why we're seeing all these cases where people are just shooting without there actually being a threat of severe bodily harm or misinterpreted threat. I would certainly hope that states would consider repealing these laws and going back to the Castle Doctrine, which is already protective of people when they're in their homes and there is no need, or on their property, and there's simply no need for changing the common law that has existed for centuries. Thanks for watching another edition of Siegel Scope, and it's back to you, Matt.
I'm Matthew Littman, your host of TAG. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did, we'd love for you to subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and tell your friends about us. You can find more episodes of TAG on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. Give us a follow on Instagram and Twitter at 97%org, and tag who you'd like us to chat with next. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.